Thanks very much, first of all, for having me here. I feel a little bit like an interloper, as may well become apparent in the course of the presentation. But since we are in the futures session, I thought I'd better start with a quote. And it's this: those who have knowledge don't predict, and those who predict don't have knowledge. And I think what's interesting is that's a quote from a Chinese poet from the 6th century BC. So bear that in mind. And so in the hope that you don't go away from today's session thinking I don't have knowledge, I'm not going to offer prediction. What I want to focus on, although of course you may go away thinking I don't have knowledge, what I want to focus on instead is the notion of uncertainty and how that has a bearing upon the agenda for road safety, behaviour and research. And the presentation will home in on 5 particular uncertainties that I suggest may be at least food for thought in today's discussion. In terms of scene setting as well, I'm not a human factors expert. In fact, I don't think I have road safety on my CV. My own personal journey has been one from civil engineering to transport sociology. And so my role today is to focus on societal context. And I hope that you'll all agree, although I think it's fair to say we often forget that context really matters when we're looking at very specific behaviours, people's everyday lives and the wider issues of social norms, which you perhaps touched upon yesterday. And just in passing an early point around perhaps the research agenda, it's my own observation that we have a number of poorly connected constituencies out there in terms of thinkers, researchers and practitioners. And I think we could do worse with perhaps the agenda being driven by this event to look at how those constituencies can become better connected so that we really draw upon truly interdisciplinary research to get to the heart of some of these future issues for road safety. Some of you will know that I've become quite involved in the application of a technique called scenario planning. Quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with scenario planning? Okay, so about a third of you. So very briefly, scenario planning is a technique to very much expose and embrace future uncertainty rather than conceal it, as we are inclined to do in our models and forecasting tools. So in this particular example from New Zealand, which is a very high-level exercise looking at the future of transport and society, it focuses in on 2 critical uncertainties, things we simply don't know where they're heading in future. The first is accessibility preference in society, ranging from physical connectivity through to a much greater preponderance of virtual connectivity, and on the vertical axis, the relative cost of energy, simply not knowing how much affordance we will have in future in terms of how we want to connect. Once you've set out something like those 2 uncertainties, you then have a canvas on which you can paint 4 plausible and typically rather divergent futures, which again are requiring you to embrace uncertainty rather than ignore it. Now, I don't propose to remain at that high level looking to the future, but the notion of scenario planning, I think, prompts to, well, a question and a point. First of all, how far out is far out enough in terms of a research agenda for looking at road safety behaviour? Certainly scenario planning tends to look 30 to 40 years out, but are we talking about 10 years here, or maybe even fewer years than that? But also, of course, the challenge is to home in amidst the many uncertainties that we face in society, and one only has to say Trump to underline uncertainty nowadays. What are the uncertainties that might matter to the particular agenda we have? And before we move into 5 uncertainties I want to briefly outline, I really would just stress that I hope your minds are open to the recognition of uncertainty and therefore the plausibility of significantly different futures. And so that may include a driverless future, but it also may include a drive-less future, or of course some combination of the 2. And it can be very easy to allow unconscious biases at this point to kick in and say, well, I'm going to ignore certain things that Lyons has to say and embrace other things because they happen to fit with my worldview. So here are the 5 uncertainties I'd like to briefly run through, and it really focuses on the issue of the mix, because you're better expert at this than me, but we're focusing here not only on the actions of drivers, but the interactions, the mix on our road network. And that's the mix in drivers, vehicles, vehicle control, familiarity with the vehicle, and the issue of how assistive technologies and distraction technologies mix together in the vehicle environment. So first of all, the mix of drivers. Well, I suppose nowadays most people are familiar with the phenomenon of peak car, the notion that something fundamental seems to have been going on in the last 10 years or so in many countries around the world. And one of the explanators behind this slowdown and even decline in the amount of driving per individual, if not in total driving, has been a diminished preponderance of young people to acquire the means to learn, to be able to drive. A big question, of course, about whether that's driven by economics or actually by structural change in attitudes and values within society. But it poses the question about whether that might be a permanent avoidance of driving in certain generations coming through, or whether that's simply a postponement, and as the economic means come to bear, they will elect to become drivers and join the road network. But that postponement could have effects for how safe those individuals are as new drivers, but new older drivers. We're seeing also, of course, in terms of acquisitions of car licensing, a gender balancing starting to emerge, which suggests that mix of drivers is changing on the road network and corresponding to the types of behaviours that the two genders may exhibit. But also the temperaments of those drivers. Again, in terms of societal context, we're in this always-on society now, and with notions of carcooning, is that going to be a blessing or a curse when you're anxious to be connected, and how will that affect your temperament as you interact with other drivers? So continuing with what I've called here the peak car culture, what implications might that have for the mix of vehicles on the road network? So first of all, if we have this phenomenon, which certainly appears to be emerging, of urbanisation with more younger people choosing to live in urban areas without a car and yet be mobile between urban areas, therefore mobile as a passenger rather than a driver, that suggests we may see growth, for instance, in coach travel on the road network. But also, if we're moving from a notion of car as status to car for efficiency purposes, then individuals may be looking, as we're perhaps seeing, for smaller, more economical cars, which may mean less full of gadgets that provide the sorts of assistive technologies you'll no doubt have been talking about. So how will that mix be unfolding? And of course, we're moving from a go and buy culture to a next day delivery culture. So what's that going to mean? And I think, Steve, your organisation's already highlighted for us this huge surge in light commercial vehicles that may be significantly explained by changing business models in terms of production and consumption, particularly around retail. So coming to the territory of vehicle control itself, and I think as we've just heard from the previous speaker, the big challenge is what transition are we facing, over what period, and what are we transitioning to? But over that period, whatever it may be, there's going to be an uncertainty around the mix of vehicle control. And it's how far, how fast really at the heart of that. First of all, of course, you need to know the levels of technology readiness, but also the extent and pace of technology adoption. But even with adoption, there's the question, of course, of technology use. So with the one level down of autonomy that Volvo are focusing upon, where there will be the option for your vehicle to be autonomous in certain road conditions, well, that certainly reminds me of the cruise control situation which we've lived with for many years, where this research recently coming out highlighting that those with cruise control, the majority never or only occasionally make use of the technology in the vehicle. Whilst we're on autonomous vehicles, a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Gartner's hype cycle? Gosh, I always wonder when I'm going to reach a point where all the hands go up and I have to move on. So very quickly, this is a company in the US that produce a whole series of mappings of emergent technologies, and they do it on an annual basis. And the hype cycle depicts the typical journey that most emergent technologies go on. And the y-axis here is exposure or visibility, and the x-axis being time. So a typical emergent technology will ascend up the initial curve as it reaches what's called a peak of inflated expectation. But then what happens over the peak is your technology descends into the trough of disillusionment before eventually emerging up the slope of enlightenment to what's called a plateau of productivity. Now, I've just put together some Gartner's hype cycle images from the last few years to show us what's happening, according to Gartner, with autonomous vehicles. So here it is, moving up the slope, and at the moment, Gartner believes, well, as of last year, that we've just come over the peak of market noise. This is where the vendors are selling furiously into our psyches. And it looks as though we're heading into the trough of disillusionment. And interestingly, Gartner have also switched from suggesting that we'll reach this plateau in 5 to 10 years to now saying that it's going to be beyond 10 years. Now, as I said at the start, those with knowledge don't predict, so you have to make your own judgments about where this is taking us. But do note that one of the technology experts behind the Gartner hype cycle reminds us that some things fall out of the trough of disillusionment and never make it. So whilst you're sat here with this absolute conviction that the future is autonomous and it's just the pathway towards it, do have a little bit of open-mindedness towards the uncertainty around that. So moving on to the next uncertainty regarding the mix of familiarity with the vehicles that are on the road as a driver. We're told that we're moving into the sharing economy. Now, what's that going to mean if we're transitioning from models of vehicle ownership to leasing or sharing of those vehicles? That seems to me to raise questions for how familiar we as a driver will be with a given vehicle that we're in control of on the road. And again, stressing interactions as well as actions, how will that affect the behaviour both of drivers and between drivers? And finally, to the uncertainty, which is familiarity. It's all very well having a timer until your phone switches off. The uncertainty about the mix of assistive technology and distractive technology within the vehicle. I've spent quite a lot of time researching the phenomenon of travel time use, and I think the world we're in, where there's been an increasing availability of mobile technologies in society and cultures of communication evolving around that, we've been really challenged to think about whether, when we're in a vehicle, it's travel time or whether it's activity time. And not to be outdone by Mars, I thought I should coin a new phrase, which is MAR, mobility as an activity, because it seems to me that that's really an important consideration, one that's always been there for road safety, but one that I suspect is uncertain and changing into the future. And I'm reminded of one of important points a colleague of mine, Steve Stradling, who's a retired professor of transport psychology, highlighted, which is the notion of travel efforts. And so when you're engaging in a journey on our road network, you're subject to 3 types of effort: the physical effort of undertaking the journey and controlling the vehicle, the cognitive effort of getting from A to B on time and safely, and then related to that, the affective or emotional effort involved in undertaking that journey. And if we have technologies which are assisting us in our undertaking of the journey, then that can reduce those efforts such that it gives more opportunity to consume time as an activity. So what future mix of assistance and distraction will we face? And I'm intrigued by the idea that we have a marketplace for 2 competing genres of technology within the vehicles on our roads. There's the intelligent transport systems industry with its long pedigree, which is really trying to improve the travel time experience as a journey. But we also now have the ICTs industry, which sees our consumption of time as something for them to exploit. And so you have the 2 competing technologies converging within the vehicle, which I think raises questions for how our attentions are divided. Although, of course, let's not forget, with the hype, I would say, around autonomous vehicles allowing us to consume our travel time, that for many of us it's always been thus when we're making familiar, predictable journeys where the efforts involved in that journey are low, and we switch to human autopilot, not technology autopilot, and the notion of anti-activity comes to the fore. Thinking and talking and listening are valid activities which are already undertaken as a driver of a vehicle. So I hope that's been useful food for thought and conveyed some sense of knowledge. Back to the chair.